The morning sun cast long shadows across the university courtyard as students hurried to their first classes, coffee cups steaming in the crisp autumn air. Inside Building C, Professor Martinez was setting up her criminology lecture, completely unaware that in exactly 17 minutes, her classroom would become the center of a story that would challenge everything the world thought it knew about human nature, survival, and the thin line between civilization and chaos.
What happened that Tuesday morning would force humanity to confront a terrifying truth. When death walks among us wearing a human face, sometimes the only thing standing between survival and slaughter is another human who has learned to grin back at the darkness. This is not a story about heroes and villains.
This is a story about what happens when the ultimate predator meets someone who refuses to become prey. The killer thought they had chosen the perfect hunting ground.
They were wrong. Marcus Chen had been awake for 36 hours straight, but his eyes were sharp as broken glass. He sat in the back row of the criminology lecture hall, his worn military-issued jacket hanging loose on his frame, watching everything and everyone with the kind of attention most people reserved for oncoming traffic. The other students saw a quiet veteran taking advantage of his GI Bill benefits. They had no idea they were sitting next to someone who had survived 3 tours in the most dangerous corners of Afghanistan, someone who could read a room like others read newspapers. Professor Sarah Martinez was halfway through her lecture on criminal psychology when the fire alarm started screaming.
The piercing sound cut through the morning air like a blade, and immediately the classroom erupted into the usual chaos of college students assuming it was just another drill. Backpacks were grabbed, phones were checked, and the general shuffling toward the exits began.
But Marcus didn't move. He had heard real alarms before, the kind that meant incoming mortars or enemy contact, and something about this one felt wrong. The timing was off, for one thing. Fire drills were scheduled in advance at universities, usually announced ahead of time. This was Tuesday morning, middle of the semester, middle of a lecture. His trained ear caught something else too, something that made his blood run cold.
The alarm wasn't coming from the building's central system. It was coming from a portable device, somewhere close by.
As students filed toward the main exit, Marcus noticed a figure near the doorway who wasn't moving with the crowd. The person was standing perfectly still watching the students pass. And there was something in their posture that triggered every survival instinct Marcus had developed over years of combat.
The figure's hand was inside a large coat, positioned in a way that suggested they were holding something heavy, something they didn't want others to see. Marcus's mind instantly cataloged the details his training had taught him to notice. The person's stance was too stable, too ready. Their breathing was controlled, deliberate. Most telling of all, their eyes weren't following the crowd toward the exit. Instead, they were scanning faces, counting, calculating. While other students pushed past him, laughing and chatting about the interruption to their morning routine, Marcus quietly reached for his phone and sent a text to 911. Possible threat at University Building C, room 204. Armed individual blocking exit. Real emergency. Then he did something that would have seemed insane to anyone else in that room. Instead of heading for the door like everyone else, Marcus moved toward the threat. Professor Martinez had noticed the strange behavior too. Something about the figure by the door had triggered her maternal instincts, the same ones that had helped her raise 3 children and recognize when something wasn't right. She had been teaching for 15 years and had never seen anyone react to a fire alarm by positioning themselves at the exit like a sentry. Her voice cut through the noise. "Everyone please move quickly and calmly to the emergency exits," she called out. But her eyes were fixed on the motionless figure. That's when everything went wrong. The figure by the door reached into their coat and pulled out what Marcus immediately recognized as a modified AR-15, the kind of weapon that could turn a classroom full of students into a massacre in under 30 seconds. The fake fire alarm had been a setup designed to channel everyone toward a single exit point where they would be trapped, helpless, perfect targets. But the shooter had made one crucial miscalculation. They had assumed they were hunting sheep. They had no idea that among the fleeing students was someone who had spent years learning how to hunt the hunters. Marcus moved like liquid violence. His body shifted from relaxed alertness to lethal precision in less than a heartbeat. He didn't shout warnings or try to reason with the threat. In combat, hesitation meant death, and mercy was a luxury that got good people killed. Instead, he became exactly what years of military training had designed him to be: a weapon pointed at anyone who threatened innocent lives. The shooter raised their rifle, finger moving toward the trigger, ready to begin their planned slaughter. They never got the chance. Marcus hit them like a freight train, his shoulder driving into the shooter's midsection with enough force to crack ribs. The rifle went flying, clattering across the floor as both figures crashed into the doorframe.
Students who had been moving toward the exit suddenly found themselves in the middle of a life-or-death struggle. Their quiet Tuesday morning transformed into something from their worst nightmares. But Marcus wasn't done.
His combat training kicked in with mechanical precision. The shooter tried to reach for a backup weapon, a handgun tucked into their belt, but Marcus had already anticipated the move.
His elbow connected with the shooter's wrist, the sharp crack of breaking bone echoing through the classroom. The gun fell harmlessly to the floor.
Professor Martinez, operating on pure adrenaline and protective instinct, started herding students toward the secondary exits, her voice steady despite the terror pounding in her chest. This way, this way.
Move quickly but stay calm. She had no idea how she managed to keep her voice level, but somehow she became the calm center of the storm, guiding her students away from the violence erupting by the main door. The shooter, desperate and increasingly frantic, tried to break free from Marcus's grip.
They were strong, motivated by whatever dark purpose had brought them to this place, but they had never faced someone who had learned to fight not for ideology or anger, but for the simple, pure purpose of protecting others. Marcus wrapped his arm around the shooter's throat, applying just enough pressure to cut off blood flow to the brain without causing permanent damage.
"Sleep," Marcus whispered, and within seconds the shooter went limp. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 90 seconds. By the time campus security arrived, followed quickly by local police and federal agents, the immediate threat was neutralized. The shooter lay unconscious on the classroom floor, zip-tied with improvised restraints Marcus had fashioned from computer cables.
The weapons were secured, the students were safe, and the massacre that should have dominated news headlines for weeks had been prevented by one person's refusal to be a victim. But as Marcus sat in the hallway giving his statement to federal agents while paramedics checked him for injuries, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning.
The shooter hadn't acted alone, he was certain of it. The planning had been too precise, the equipment too sophisticated, the timing too perfect.
Someone else was out there, someone who had expected their partner to succeed, and they would be very unhappy about the morning's unexpected outcome. Detective Sarah Kim, a 15-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police Force, knelt beside the unconscious shooter and carefully examined the weapons.
What she found made her blood run cold. The rifle had been modified with illegal components, designed to maximize casualties in minimum time. The ammunition was armor-piercing, meant to cut through police vests like paper. This hadn't been a random act of violence or a crime of passion.
This was a planned execution, a carefully orchestrated attack designed to kill as many people as possible. As the unconscious shooter was loaded onto a stretcher, their eyes flickered open for just a moment.
In that brief instant, they looked directly at Marcus with an expression that wasn't anger or fear. It was recognition, and something that looked disturbingly like satisfaction. "This isn't over," the shooter whispered before losing consciousness again.
Marcus heard the words and his jaw tightened. He had prevented one tragedy, but he could feel the weight of something larger pressing down on the morning.
The shooter was right. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. As students were led away to safety and the classroom was sealed as a crime scene, Marcus remained behind, his eyes scanning the area with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that the first attack was often just a distraction for the real threat. He had saved lives today, but the war was far from finished.
Outside, news crews were already setting up, ready to turn the morning's events into another story about random violence in America. They had no idea they were actually covering the opening moves of something much larger, much more dangerous, and much more personal than anyone could imagine.
The killer had walked into class expecting to find victims. Instead, they had found Marcus Chen, a human from what his military buddies had jokingly called the Deathworld of Afghanistan.
And Marcus was grinning, not with humor, but with the cold satisfaction of someone who had just sent a message to anyone else who thought they could hunt innocent people in his presence. The message was simple: choose your prey more carefully.
The war for the souls of ordinary people was about to begin, and Marcus Chen was ready to fight it. The FBI field office buzzed with activity that felt more like a war room than a government building. Agent Jennifer Walsh had been tracking domestic terror networks for 8 years, but the evidence spread across her desk painted a picture that made her stomach turn. The failed attack at the university wasn't an isolated incident. It was a test run, a proof of concept for something much larger and infinitely more dangerous. Marcus sat across from her, his coffee growing cold as he studied surveillance photos and communication intercepts.
The government had brought him in as a consultant, officially because of his military background and his first-hand experience with the shooter.
Unofficially, they needed someone who understood how predators thought, someone who could think like the enemy without becoming one. The shooter we stopped yesterday is named David Kellerman,
Agent Walsh explained, sliding a thick file across the table.
28 years old, no criminal record, worked as a software engineer until 6 months ago. On paper, he's exactly the kind of person who should never end up planning a mass shooting.
Marcus flipped through the file, his trained eye catching details that others might miss. What changed 6 months ago? That's what we're trying to figure out.
According to his digital footprint, he started spending time in online communities that we've been monitoring. But these aren't your typical hate groups.
There's something new, something we haven't seen before. The agent pulled up a series of encrypted chat logs on her laptop.
They call themselves the Selection Committee. Their basic belief is that modern society has made humans too soft, too weak to survive in the real world.
They think that only through experiencing real danger, real violence, can people become truly alive. Marcus's jaw tightened as he read the messages. He had seen this kind of thinking before in soldiers who had been in combat too long, who had started to believe that violence was the only authentic human experience. But this was different. This was organized, systematic, and spreading. They target specific locations, Walsh continued.
Schools, universities, shopping centers, places where they think people have become complacent and comfortable. Their goal isn't just to cause casualties.
They want to wake people up, force them to confront what they call biological reality. And Kellerman was their test case, Marcus said, understanding beginning to dawn. We think so. But here's what's really disturbing. Based on the communications we've intercepted, the attack yesterday wasn't supposed to fail. They were expecting a high body count, national news coverage, and a specific type of response from the authorities. Marcus studied the chat logs more carefully. The messages were written in a kind of coded language, but the meaning was clear enough.
The Selection Committee wasn't just planning random attacks. They were trying to create a specific kind of chaos, the type that would justify their worldview and recruit more members.
They wanted the attack to succeed so they could point to the victims and say, "See, these people died because they weren't prepared for reality. They were soft, weak, unprepared for what the real world looks like," Marcus said.
Exactly. But your intervention changed their narrative. Instead of victims, they got a reminder that not everyone in modern society is helpless. And that's made them very, very angry. Agent Walsh pulled up another set of messages, these ones from the previous 12 hours. The tone was different now, more urgent, more focused.
The Selection Committee had shifted from planning random attacks to targeting one specific person, Marcus Chen. They've decided you represent everything they hate about modern society, Walsh explained.
In their minds, you're a government-trained killer who prevents natural selection from taking its course. They think you're keeping weak people alive when they should be allowed to die. Marcus almost laughed at the twisted logic. He had spent 3 years in Afghanistan protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, fighting against extremists who believed their ideology justified killing innocents. Now he was facing a different kind of extremist, but with the same fundamental delusion. That their personal beliefs gave them the right to decide who lived and who died. "How many of them are there?" he asked. "That's the problem. We don't know. The network is designed to be decentralized, anonymous, resistant to law enforcement infiltration. We've identified maybe 30 active members, but there could be hundreds more." The agent showed him a map marked with red pins. Each pin represented a location where Selection Committee members had been active, and the pattern was disturbing. They weren't concentrated in any one area. They were spread across the entire country, in big cities and small towns, among people from every background and profession. "The scary part is how normal they are," Walsh said. "Engineers, teachers, middle management, college students. People who seem perfectly functional on the surface but have been radicalized by this idea that society needs to be shocked into remembering how to be violent." Marcus understood the appeal, even if he found it repugnant. Modern life was safe, predictable, comfortable in ways that human beings had never experienced before in history. Some people interpreted that safety as weakness, as a departure from human nature. They were wrong, but their wrongness didn't make them any less dangerous. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Marcus showed it to Agent Walsh, and her face went pale. "Tomorrow morning, Campus Quad. Come alone, or we'll start with the professor who helped you yesterday. You have 12 hours to decide if you're ready for biological reality." "Professor Martinez," Marcus said immediately. "We need to get her into protective custody right now." But even as Agent Walsh started making phone calls, Marcus knew it wouldn't be enough. The Selection Committee had spent months planning, recruiting, preparing. They wouldn't be stopped by standard law enforcement tactics.
They had studied their enemies, learned from the failure of yesterday's attack, and adapted their strategy.
They're not going to stop with one confrontation, Marcus realized.
This is bigger than just targeting me. They want to create a demonstration, something that proves their point about modern society being weak and unprepared. Agent Walsh finished her phone call and turned back to him. Professor Martinez is safe. We've got her in a secure location. But you're right about this being bigger. Our analysts think tomorrow's confrontation is meant to be recorded, broadcast online, used as recruitment material. Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. Millions of people going about their daily lives trusting that the world was safe enough for them to focus on work and family and the thousand small details that made life meaningful.
The selection committee saw that trust as weakness.
Marcus saw it as something worth protecting. They want me to show up alone, he said. Absolutely not. We'll have surveillance, backup teams, snipers if necessary. This is federal jurisdiction now. Marcus shook his head.
You don't understand. If I show up with a federal response team, they'll just disappear and try again somewhere else, with someone else.
But if I show up alone, they'll commit to the confrontation. They'll expose themselves and get you killed in the process. Maybe, or maybe I'll remind them why their philosophy is wrong. Agent Walsh studied his face, seeing something there that reminded her of why she had gotten into law enforcement in the first place. What are you thinking? Marcus turned back to her, and for the first time since yesterday's attack, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. I'm thinking that these people have never actually faced biological reality. They've been playing with ideas about violence and survival from the safety of their computers in their meeting rooms. Tomorrow, they're going to learn the difference between theory and practice. You're talking about going in there to fight them. I'm talking about going in there to finish what they started. They want to test whether modern society has made people too weak to survive. Fine, let's find out. The rest of the evening was spent in preparation. Marcus reviewed building layouts, studied communication intercepts, and prepared for what would either be the end of the selection committee's recruitment campaign or his own death. Agent Walsh and her team worked on backup plans, surveillance positions, and contingency strategies. But as midnight approached and the federal building grew quiet, Marcus found himself thinking about Professor Martinez and the students who had been in that classroom. They had trusted that their Tuesday morning would be normal, safe, predictable. They had been right to trust that, and the selection committee had been wrong to try to shatter it.
Tomorrow, Marcus would make sure they understood the difference between strength and brutality, between survival and murder. He would show them what biological reality actually looked like when someone refused to be prey. The selection committee thought they were dealing with a product of modern society, someone made soft by comfort and safety. They had no idea they were about to face someone who had learned to be human in places where humanity was a choice, not a given.
Someone who had discovered that the strongest people weren't those who embraced violence, but those who controlled it. Marcus cleaned his sidearm one last time and settled in to wait for dawn. Tomorrow, the selection committee would learn why their philosophy was not just wrong, but pathetically naive. They wanted biological reality. They were about to get more than they bargained for. Dawn came early to the university campus, painting the quad in soft golden light that made the morning feel almost peaceful. Students were beginning their daily routines, walking to early classes with coffee cups and backpacks, completely unaware that they were moving through what would soon become a battlefield. Marcus arrived 2 hours before the scheduled confrontation, dressed in civilian clothes but moving with the careful precision of someone who expected to fight for his life. Agent Walsh's surveillance team was already in position, hidden in buildings around the quad, but Marcus knew they would be useless if things went according to the selection committee's plan. The extremists had chosen this location specifically because it offered multiple escape routes, crowd cover, and symbolic value. They wanted their confrontation with Marcus to take place in the heart of the academic world they despised. Marcus positioned himself near the central fountain, exactly where the text message had specified, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. They came from 4 different directions, moving through the morning crowd, like sharks, through a school of fish. Marcus counted at least 8 members, possibly more, hidden among the students and faculty going about their morning routines. They were dressed to blend in, carrying backpacks and messenger bags that could easily conceal weapons, looking like graduate students or young professionals. But Marcus could see past the camouflage. Their movements were too coordinated, too purposeful. Their eyes were constantly scanning not for friends or familiar faces, but for threats and opportunities. Most tellingly, they were all wearing small earpieces, the kind used for tactical communication. The leader stepped forward first, a woman in her early 30s with the kind of confident posture that suggested extensive training. Marcus recognized the type immediately. Former military, probably special forces, someone who had taken legitimate training and twisted it toward illegitimate ends.
Marcus Chen, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the space between them. My name is Sarah Voss.
I was a Marine Corps sniper for 8 years before I realized what we were really doing over there.
And what was that?
Marcus asked, keeping his tone conversational despite the tension building in the air around them. Protecting weakness. Keeping people alive who should have been allowed to fail.
Fighting wars for a society that's forgotten how to fight for itself. Marcus could see other selection committee members moving into position around the quad, creating a loose circle with him at the center.
Students were beginning to notice that something unusual was happening, but they hadn't yet understood the danger. A few were taking out phones, probably preparing to record what they thought would be an interesting confrontation.
You know what I think? Marcus said, taking a step closer to Voss. I think you're angry because you learned how to kill people, but you never learned how to save them. The comment hit home.
Voss's eyes flashed with genuine anger, and Marcus could see her hand move slightly toward whatever weapon she was carrying. But she maintained her composure, probably because this conversation was being recorded for later use as recruitment material.
Yesterday, you prevented natural selection from taking its course, she continued. Those students were weak, unprepared, soft from years of safety and comfort.
They deserved to die because they couldn't protect themselves.
And you decided you had the right to make that judgment?
Someone has to.
Society won't do it itself. Marcus almost laughed. Do you have any idea how arrogant that sounds? You think you understand survival, but you've never actually had to survive anything real. You've just played with guns and convinced yourself that makes you some kind of evolutionary judge.
Around the quad, more students were stopping to watch the confrontation. Marcus could see Agent Walsh's team moving carefully through the crowd, but they were hampered by the presence of innocents. The selection committee had planned this perfectly. Any law enforcement response would put civilians at risk. But Marcus had his own plan.
You want to test biological reality? He asked, his voice carrying loud enough for everyone to hear. Fine.
But let's be clear about what that actually means. Without warning, Marcus moved toward the nearest selection committee member, a young man who had been trying to position himself behind the growing crowd of spectators. The man reached for what Marcus assumed was a concealed weapon, but Marcus was already inside his guard, his hand clamping down on the man's wrist with enough force to make him gasp in pain.
Biological reality means that when you threaten innocent people, someone else might decide to stop you, Marcus said loudly enough for everyone to hear. It means that predators sometimes discover they're not at the top of the food chain. The man tried to break free, but Marcus twisted his arm behind his back and forced him to the ground.
Students nearby gasped and started backing away, finally realizing that this wasn't just an argument between strangers. It means, Marcus continued, his knee pressed into the would-be attacker's back, that all your theories about weakness and strength are about to meet actual reality. Voss had drawn her sidearm, but she couldn't get a clear shot with Marcus positioned behind her accomplice.
"Let him go," she shouted. "This is between you and me."
No, it's not, Marcus replied, reaching into the downed man's jacket and pulling out a modified pistol.
It's between you and everyone you've threatened, and that includes every person on this campus. Marcus could hear sirens in the distance, but they were still minutes away.
Agent Walsh's surveillance team was moving closer, but they were being careful not to escalate the situation while civilians were in danger. It was exactly the kind of tactical situation the selection committee had hoped to create. Chaos, confusion, and multiple threats that law enforcement couldn't address simultaneously. But Marcus wasn't law enforcement. He was something much simpler and much more dangerous. Someone who had decided that the selection committee's philosophy needed to be publicly, definitively disproven.
You want to know what I learned in Afghanistan? He called out to Voss, still maintaining his position behind her accomplice. I learned that the strongest people aren't the ones who embrace violence.
They're the ones who stand between violence and innocent people. Voss was moving now, trying to get an angle that would let her shoot Marcus without hitting her own team member.
But Marcus had positioned himself perfectly, using terrain and cover the way he had been trained to do in much more dangerous situations than a college campus. I learned that real strength isn't about being willing to kill, Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the quad where dozens of students and faculty were now watching with horrified fascination. It's about being willing to die to protect people who can't protect themselves. Another selection committee member tried to approach from Marcus's left side, but Marcus had seen him coming. Without releasing his grip on the first attacker, Marcus swept the second man's legs,
sending him crashing into a nearby bench. The man's concealed weapon skittered across the pavement, and several students screamed and started running. "And most importantly," Marcus said, his voice rising above the growing chaos, "I learned that people like you always make the same mistake. You think that because you're willing to hurt innocent people that makes you strong. But it doesn't. It just makes you predictable." Voss finally had a clear shot, but as she raised her weapon, something extraordinary happened. Instead of running away from the violence, a group of students moved between her and Marcus. They formed a human shield, not because anyone had asked them to, but because they had understood something fundamental about what they were witnessing. "You want to shoot him," called out a young woman who Marcus recognized from Professor Martinez's class. "You'll have to shoot us first." More students joined the protective circle, and then faculty members, and then campus staff. Within minutes, Marcus was surrounded by dozens of people who had made a conscious choice to stand between him and the weapons pointed at him. Voss looked around the quad with growing desperation. Her carefully planned confrontation was falling apart. Her tactical advantages were disappearing. And worst of all, she was being recorded by dozens of phones as she pointed a gun at college students who were protecting someone they barely knew. "This is what biological reality actually looks like," Marcus said, his voice now calm and steady. "When people are threatened, other people step up to protect them. When predators attack, communities defend themselves. Not because they're trained to, but because it's what human beings do when they're not being manipulated by people like you." The sirens were getting closer, and Agent Walsh's team was moving into final positions. The selection committee's window for escape was closing rapidly. But more importantly, their entire philosophical framework was being demolished in real time by the very people they considered weak and unprepared. "You think modern society has made people soft," Marcus continued, "but what it's actually done is given them the luxury of being gentle. And when you threaten that gentleness, you discover that it's not weakness. It's a choice. And when that choice is taken away, you find out what people are really capable of." Voss lowered her weapon, finally understanding that she had lost more than just a tactical engagement. The selection committee's entire recruitment strategy depended on demonstrating that ordinary people were helpless victims who needed their protection or deserved their contempt. But the crowd of students and faculty who had spontaneously formed a protective circle around Marcus had proved exactly the opposite. "This isn't over," she said, echoing her unconscious accomplice from the day before. "Yes, it is," Marcus replied. And for the first time since this had all started, he was actually smiling. "You just proved that everything you believe is wrong." And everyone here saw it happen. As federal agents moved in to make arrests, and the selection committee's remaining members were either captured or fled the scene, Marcus found himself surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand, thank him, ask if he was all right. These were the same students who, according to the selection committee's philosophy, should have been helpless victims. Instead, they had become exactly what Marcus had always known they were: human beings who chose compassion and courage when it mattered most. The selection committee had wanted to test biological reality. They had discovered that when pushed to their limits, humans didn't become predators, they became protectors. And that made all the difference in the world. The abandoned warehouse sat on the outskirts of the city like a monument to industrial decay, its broken windows staring blindly at the surrounding wasteland of empty lots and forgotten dreams. Inside, what remained of the selection committee had gathered for what their encrypted communications called final selection. The events at the university had shattered their organization, but the core leadership had survived, and they were more determined than ever to prove their philosophy correct. Marcus knew they would come for him eventually. People like the selection committee couldn't accept being proven wrong, especially not in such a public, humiliating way. Agent Walsh had offered him protective custody, but Marcus had declined. Running from extremists only encouraged them to find easier targets, and he had no intention of letting them hurt innocent people because he had made himself unavailable. Instead, he had spent the last week hunting them. The FBI's investigation had uncovered the selection committee's command structure, but the survivors had gone underground, communicating through channels that were nearly impossible to trace. Nearly, but not completely. Marcus had learned a few things about tracking dangerous people during his years in Afghanistan, and those skills translated surprisingly well to domestic situations. The key was understanding how they thought. The selection committee believed they were superior to ordinary people because they were willing to embrace violence, but that same willingness made them predictable. They couldn't resist opportunities to prove their superiority, which meant they would eventually reveal themselves by trying to set up another confrontation. Marcus had been leaving them opportunities to find him for 3 days, creating patterns they could track, establishing routines they could exploit. He wanted them to think they were hunting him when actually he was drawing them into a trap. The warehouse had been perfect bait, isolated, defensible, symbolic of the kind of urban decay they blamed on modern society's weakness. Marcus had made sure they knew he would be there alone at midnight on Friday. What they didn't know was that he wouldn't be as alone as he appeared. Agent Walsh and her tactical team were positioned in buildings surrounding the warehouse, but they had strict orders not to intervene unless civilians were at immediate risk. This confrontation needed to end decisively, in a way that would prevent the selection committee from simply reorganizing and trying again somewhere else.
Marcus entered the warehouse through the main entrance, making no attempt at stealth. He wanted them to know he was there, wanted them to feel confident about their tactical position.
The building's interior was a maze of rusted machinery and concrete pillars, perfect for guerrilla warfare, but also perfect for what Marcus had in mind. "Chen!" the voice echoed from somewhere deep in the building.
Marcus recognized it as belonging to Sarah Voss, the former Marine sniper who had led the confrontation at the university. "We know you're here.
Time to finish what we started." Marcus moved deeper into the warehouse, his footsteps deliberate and loud. He was carrying his sidearm, but he hoped he wouldn't need to use it.
What he was planning was more psychological than physical, though he was prepared for violence if necessary. "I've been thinking about what you said," Marcus called back, his voice carrying through the cavernous space.
"About biological reality, about survival of the fittest. You might have a point."
He could hear movement around him now, the soft scraping of boots on concrete, the whisper of fabric against metal. They were surrounding him, just as he had expected. The warehouse had multiple levels connected by metal staircases, giving them high ground and clear fields of fire. It was exactly the kind of tactical advantage they would find irresistible.
"Maybe modern society has made people too soft," Marcus continued, stopping in the center of the main floor where they would have the best shots at him. "Maybe we do need to remember what it means to fight for survival."
A spotlight blazed to life from one of the upper levels, pinning Marcus in a cone of harsh white light. He could see figures moving in the shadows around the catwalks, at least 6 of them, all armed, all positioned to prevent his escape.
"Now you're learning." Voss's voice came from directly above him. "The question is whether you're ready to evolve or whether you're going to die stuck in the past." Marcus smiled up at the shadows. "That's an interesting question, but I think you're asking the wrong person." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been so focused on proving that I'm weak that you forgot to ask whether you're strong enough."
Without warning, Marcus dove toward the nearest concrete pillar, just as rifle shots began echoing through the warehouse. But the shots weren't coming from the selection committee's positions. They were coming from outside the building, precise and calculated, taking out the warehouse's remaining light sources and plunging the interior into near total darkness. In the chaos that followed, Marcus heard exactly what he had been hoping to hear: panic.
"Who's shooting? Where are they? I can't see anything." This wasn't the plan. Marcus had shared more than just his location with Agent Walsh. He had shared his strategy, and she had understood exactly what he was trying to accomplish. The selection committee had spent so much energy focusing on their target that they had forgotten to watch their own backs, but the real surprise was yet to come. Emergency lighting flickered on throughout the warehouse, battery-powered floods that Marcus had positioned earlier in the week during his reconnaissance. The selection committee found themselves illuminated like actors on a stage, their tactical positions revealed, their advantage eliminated. But they weren't alone. Moving through the warehouse like ghosts were 12 figures in tactical gear. But these weren't federal agents. They were veterans, men and women who had served with Marcus in Afghanistan, who had answered his call when he explained what was happening. They moved with the kind of precision that came from years of combat experience, not the theoretical knowledge that the selection committee had acquired from training manuals and internet forums. "Biological reality," Marcus called out, his voice now amplified by the acoustic properties of the warehouse, "isn't about the strong preying on the weak. It's about the experienced teaching lessons to the inexperienced." The selection committee tried to maintain their positions, but they were facing people who had learned warfare in places where mistakes meant death. Within minutes, their carefully planned ambush had turned into a rout. They found themselves surrounded, outgunned, and facing opponents who understood tactics at a level they could never hope to match. "You wanted to test survival skills," Marcus continued as his teammates efficiently disarmed and secured the extremists. "Congratulations. You just discovered the difference between talking about violence and facing people who actually understand it."
Voss was the last to surrender, her sniper rifle finally lowering when she realized that her position had been compromised and escape was impossible. As she was brought down to the main floor in zip-tie restraints, her face showed not just defeat but genuine confusion. How? She asked. Marcus studied her for a moment before answering. You made the same mistake that every extremist makes. You assumed that because you were willing to hurt people, that made you dangerous. But willingness to commit violence and ability to survive violence are two completely different things. We were soldiers. We know how to fight. No, Marcus replied. You were soldiers who learned how to use weapons, but you never learned why we use them. How? You never understood that the point of being strong isn't to dominate the weak. It's to protect them. Agent Walsh and her team arrived shortly after to take custody of the prisoners. But Marcus could see that this confrontation had accomplished something more important than just arresting terrorists. The selection committee's entire philosophy had been based on the idea that modern society had made people weak and helpless. But what they had encountered instead was a community of people who had chosen to stand together against threats. The students who had formed a protective circle at the university. The veterans who had dropped everything to help a former comrade face down extremists. The federal agents who had trusted Marcus's judgment and supported his unorthodox strategy. The professors and staff who had risked their own safety to protect their students. You know what biological reality actually looks like? Marcus asked Voss as she was led toward the federal transport vehicles. It looks like people choosing to help each other survive, not trying to prove who deserves to die. As the warehouse emptied and the selection committee was processed into federal custody, Marcus found himself standing alone in the space where so much violence had been planned. But the violence had been contained, redirected, used to protect rather than harm. Agent Walsh approached him as he prepared to leave.
The Bureau wants to offer you a consulting position, she said. This kind of domestic extremism isn't going away, and we could use someone who understands how to counter it. Marcus considered the offer for a moment.
Will I be able to prevent attacks or just respond to them? With your help, we might be able to do both. Marcus looked around the warehouse one last time, thinking about the students in Professor Martinez's classroom. About the community that had spontaneously formed to protect him at the university. About the veterans who had answered his call without question. All right, he said, but we do this my way. No more waiting for extremists to make the first move. We find them before they can hurt anyone. Agent Walsh nodded. Agreed. But I have to ask, how did you know your plan would work? How did you know the selection committee would fall for the trap? Marcus smiled as they walked toward the exit. Because people who spend all their time thinking about how to hurt others never spend enough time thinking about how others might hurt them. They're so focused on being predators that they forget predators can become prey. Outside, the city lights stretched to the horizon. Millions of people sleeping peacefully because they trusted that someone would stand between them and the darkness. The selection committee had been wrong about everything, but especially about one thing. Modern society hadn't made people weak. It had given them the freedom to be strong in ways that mattered, and Marcus Chen was proof that some humans from the death world of combat could choose to use their strength to build rather than destroy, to protect rather than prey, to smile at the darkness not because they enjoyed it but because they refused to let it win. 6 months after the warehouse confrontation, Marcus Chen stood in front of a classroom at the FBI Academy in Quantico, facing 35 of the Bureau's brightest young agents. The course he was teaching didn't appear in any official catalog. Officially, it was listed as Advanced Threat Assessment, but everyone who took it knew its real purpose, learning how to identify and stop domestic extremists before they could act.
Selection Committee had been more than just a terrorist organization. It had been a symptom of a larger problem, a growing movement of people who believed that modern society needed to be shocked back into what they considered natural human behavior.
Even with the core leadership in federal prison, copycat groups were emerging, each convinced they had learned from the selection committee's mistakes. Marcus had spent the last 6 months tracking these emerging threats, working with Agent Walsh and her expanded domestic terrorism task force to prevent attacks before they could be carried out. It was exhausting work, requiring constant vigilance and a deep understanding of how extremist thinking evolved and spread. But it was also deeply satisfying. Every prevented attack meant families who got to go home safely, students who could focus on learning instead of fear, communities that remained intact instead of being shattered by violence.
The most dangerous thing about ideological extremists, Marcus told his class, isn't their willingness to use violence.
It's their ability to convince themselves that violence is justified, even necessary. One of the agents raised her hand. How do we counter that kind of thinking when it's already taken hold? Marcus considered the question carefully. It was one he had been wrestling with since this all began. You don't, he said finally. Once someone has fully committed to an extremist ideology, logical arguments won't reach them. The time to intervene is before they reach that point. He pulled up a series of case studies on the classroom smartboard, profiles of individuals who had been identified and intercepted before they could carry out planned attacks.
Each case showed the same pattern: isolation, gradual radicalization through online communities, increasing detachment from normal social connections.
The selection committee's recruitment strategy was sophisticated, Marcus continued. They didn't target obviously unstable people. They looked for individuals who were intelligent, capable, but disconnected from their communities. People who felt that modern life lacked meaning or purpose.
Agent Sarah Kim, who had been transferred to the Domestic Terrorism Task Force after her work on the original case, added what made them particularly dangerous was how they packaged their extremism. They didn't present themselves as terrorists. They presented themselves as people who had discovered uncomfortable truths about human nature. Marcus nodded. That's exactly right. And that's why traditional law enforcement approaches weren't sufficient.
We weren't just dealing with criminals. We were dealing with people who believed they were evolutionarily superior to everyone around them. This is the book. It's about history.
The classroom was quiet as the agents absorbed this information. Most of them had joined the Bureau to fight clear-cut crimes, bank robberies, kidnappings, drug trafficking.
The idea of combating extremist ideology was more complex, more psychologically demanding than anything they had trained for. Sir, another agent asked, how do we identify these groups before they act?
The selection committee operated for months without being detected. Marcus had been expecting this question. The key is understanding that extremist groups can't resist testing their beliefs against reality.
They need validation, and that means they eventually have to move from theory to practice. He showed them communication intercepts from several emerging groups, carefully anonymized to protect ongoing investigations.
Look at the pattern. They start with abstract discussions about societal weakness.
Then they move to identifying specific examples of that weakness. Then they begin planning interventions to address those examples.
Interventions, Agent Kim said grimly. That's what they call terrorist attacks.
Exactly.
But here's what's important. There's always a progression. They don't jump straight from online discussions to mass violence. They test their beliefs with smaller actions first: harassment, intimidation, minor assaults. If we're watching for those patterns, we can identify and disrupt them before they escalate. Marcus pulled up a map showing the locations of 37 successful interventions over the past 6 months.
Red pins marked prevented attacks, yellow pins showed groups that had been disrupted before they could progress to violence, and green pins indicated individuals who had been successfully de-radicalized through community intervention programs. The most important thing to understand, Marcus said, is that we're not just fighting extremists, we're fighting extremism itself. And you can't defeat an ideology with arrests alone. You have to offer people something better. One of the younger agents looked puzzled.
Something better than what? Something better than the certainty that extremism provides. Most people who get drawn into these groups aren't looking for violence.
They're looking for purpose, for community, for a sense that their lives matter. Extremist groups exploit that need by offering simple answers to complex problems.
Marcus thought about his own journey, from the confusion and isolation he had felt after leaving the military to the sense of purpose he had found in protecting others from the same kinds of threats he had faced overseas. The real solution isn't just stopping bad actors, he continued. It's creating communities where people can find meaning and connection without having to embrace destructive ideologies. Agent Kim raised her hand. How do we do that?
Community building isn't exactly in the FBI's mission statement. Marcus smiled.
No, but identifying and supporting people who are doing that work is. Every community has people who are already working to create positive alternatives.
Teachers, coaches, mentors, community organizers. Our job is to make sure they have the resources and support they need.
The class continued for another hour, covering tactical approaches to surveillance and interdiction, but Marcus could see that the larger lesson was sinking in. Fighting domestic extremism wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about understanding and addressing the social conditions that made extremism attractive in the first place. After class, Marcus walked across the Quantico campus to a different kind of meeting.
In a conference room overlooking the Potomac River, he joined Agent Walsh and representatives from a dozen other federal agencies to review the week's intelligence reports. 3 new groups have appeared in our monitoring systems, Agent Walsh reported.
2 on the West Coast, 1 in Texas. All showing the same behavioral patterns we've learned to recognize.
Marcus studied the files. Timeline to potential action? Based on the selection committee model, we estimate 6 to 8 weeks before they move from planning to implementation. That gives us time.
What about community resources in those areas? A representative from the Department of Education spoke up. We've identified potential partners in all 3 locations: schools, youth programs, veterans organizations.
People who are already working to provide positive alternatives.
This was the part of the work that Marcus found most hopeful.
For every extremist group they identified, they also found communities of people who were actively working to make their neighborhoods safer, more connected, more resilient against radicalization. The university where this all started has become a model for other institutions. Agent Walsh noted, Professor Martinez has developed a curriculum that helps students recognize and resist extremist recruitment. It's being implemented at campuses across the country.
Marcus nodded.
Professor Martinez had turned her traumatic experience into something constructive, using her expertise in criminology to help others understand how extremist thinking developed and spread. It was exactly the kind of positive response that made long-term victory possible.
As the meeting concluded and the other participants filed out, Agent Walsh stayed behind to speak with Marcus privately. I have something I want to show you, she said, pulling up a video on her laptop.
The video showed a college campus that Marcus didn't recognize, students walking between classes on a typical spring day. But this wasn't surveillance footage.
It was a promotional video created by the students themselves, showcasing their community resilience program.
Watch this part, Agent Walsh said, pointing to the screen. A young man appeared on camera, speaking directly to the viewer, with the kind of confidence that came from genuine conviction.
6 months ago, our campus was targeted by extremists who believed that college students were weak, unprepared for the real world. They were wrong.
Not because we're naturally strong, but because we choose to support each other. The video showed students engaged in various activities, self-defense classes, community service projects, peer counseling programs, emergency response training.
But more than that, it showed people who had decided that the best response to those who preyed on community weakness was to build community strength. This is happening at universities across the country, Agent Walsh explained. Students who heard about what happened here decided they wanted to be prepared, not for violence, but for protecting each other. Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since the warehouse confrontation: genuine optimism. The selection committee had wanted to prove that modern society was weak, that people needed to be shocked into embracing their animal nature. Instead, they had inspired a generation of young people to discover their human nature, their capacity for cooperation, protection, and mutual support. There's something else, Agent Walsh continued. The Bureau wants to make your program permanent, not just training agents, but developing a comprehensive approach to preventing domestic extremism. You'd have your own division, your own budget, your own team. Marcus considered the offer.
It would mean less time in the field, more time in meetings and bureaucracy. But it would also mean the chance to build something lasting, something that could prevent future extremist movements from taking root.
On one condition, he said. What's that? We focus as much on supporting communities as we do on stopping extremists. For every dollar we spend on surveillance and enforcement, we spend $1 on programs that give people positive alternatives. Agent Walsh smiled.
I think we can arrange that. As Marcus left Quantico that evening, driving back toward the university where this had all begun, he thought about the students in that promotional video, the professors who had transformed their trauma into teaching tools, the communities that had chosen to respond to threats by becoming stronger and more connected. The selection committee had believed that biological reality meant the strong preying on the weak, that civilization was just a thin veneer covering humanity's true nature.
They had been wrong about everything. Biological reality was about cooperation, about groups working together to overcome challenges that no individual could face alone. Marcus smiled as he drove through the evening traffic, surrounded by millions of people going about their daily lives, trusting that tomorrow would be safe enough to make plans, to build relationships, to create something better than what existed today. That trust wasn't naive. It was earned, maintained by people who had chosen to stand between the darkness and the light, not because they enjoyed violence, but because they refused to let violence win. The selection committee had wanted to wake people up to biological reality. They had succeeded, just not in the way they intended. They had reminded an entire generation that humans were strong, not when they embraced their capacity for destruction, but when they chose to use that capacity for protection. And Marcus Chen, the human from the death world who had learned to grin at the darkness, was still grinning.
Not because he enjoyed the fight, but because he had discovered that the best way to defeat monsters was to help other people become heroes. The real biological reality was simple. When good people stood together, evil people lost. And that made all the difference in the world.
A killer walked into class. The human from the Deathworld grinned. HFY Sci-Fi.